And now let's dial up this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
And I know the podcast is running a bit long this week, but I really want to take time to deal with this one because it's hardly a secret that I'm a huge fan of the Atheist Experience TV show and their podcast, and especially Matt Dillahunty. I've referenced Dillahunty quite a bit, even in my videos supporting libertarianism, because he does a good job of stating all these first principles on which everything is based. Yet, when he and his co-hosts go into politics, like many skeptics, they end up throwing it all out the window and becoming just like the very woos they rail against on the show. Case in point, last Sunday, he and his co-host Tracie Harris dealt with his caller Jared. I think I should say that this was nominated by pretty much everybody. I mean, I heard it myself and was already doing it, but man, people posted it to the forum, they sent me PMs on YouTube, they sent me emails. So they actually did a pretty good job with this caller Jared until this happened.
Because when you also say that, for example, believing in a government system in itself would be immoral because the government itself poses will upon another person.
Can I just interject here? When you were using the example of somebody using force, in my mind I was thinking, no, I can think of lots of situations where I think it would be absolutely not just a good idea to use force against someone to get what you want, but where I would think it would be obligatory. Where it would be like a moral obligation to do that. So for example, I know a situation that happened here in Austin where a woman was trying to stab her landlord to death and the police officer shot her dead. She refused to drop the knife and she was killed. And in my opinion, that's fine to use force to get what you want in that situation.
Well, here's the thing to understand. It would be fine for anyone to use force in that situation because it's a response to an initiation of force by others. So the example Tracie gives is perfectly in line with libertarianism.
Yeah, I mean, this would be no different than if she had hired a private security company to do this and they were just protecting their boss.
Yeah, or just anyone on the street happens to have a gun, see it happening. Oh, wait, I'm going to pull out my gun and I'm going to stop her. You know, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm a big guy. I'm somewhat intimidating people. I've had people pay, in Florida, you can just basically pay people carte blanche to be part of a crew that evicts people, which I've done before for money. And I've dealt with more than a few crazy people myself that that have quote-unquote initiated force on me.
Yeah, but then she says...
Right, and so when the government applies force to get what they want, a lot of times that is obligatory. In fact, that police officer was the government applying force in order to get what they want.
Yeah, quite often the arguments on this tend to portray the government as if it's something else. We are the government.
Yeah.
Well, talk about almost getting the point. The government isn't us. The government is politicians and bureaucrats. But the point is, government is people, and therefore there are no moral principles that apply to them but not to others, unless you want to elevate them to demigods or at least high priests.
This goes back to, plenty of issues we've discussed here on the podcast. As you said, it's a deification of these folks as being higher than us.
It's divine right of kings. That's what it is. It's divine right of kings. Let's just say it.
Are you a citizen of the United States?
Yes, I am.
Are you being forced to stay a citizen of the United States?
Yes, actually, because there's that $2,350 expat tax we talked about a few weeks ago. Plus, they reserve the right to detain you indefinitely at airports or border crossings.
Yeah, it's not like I can buy an island off the coast of the Caribbean and create my own country.
People actually tried that once. I forget, it was like in the Pacific, I think, or somewhere. They got this island and they tried setting up a free society on it, and one of the neighboring governments sent the military in and just took over them.
Yeah, I would love to just go there and live the rest of my days. Do you think the U.S. government will let me do that?
As long as you pay your taxes to the IRS, yeah.
Are you eligible to run for office and be an elected official in the United States?
Yeah, if I stand out in the rain all day and in the hot sun collecting signatures and run all my coffers down to zero just to get on the ballot and then get excluded from the debates and everything else. And
me, former candidate for office, there's a lot of bullshit and Orwellian funny words that are used to run. It's one thing to say, okay, yes, you need 1% of all eligible voters to sign a petition for you. When you say that, it doesn't sound so bad.
But when 1% is 70,000 people.
Or even in my case, I had to get 1% of the people that were in my district, which is about 750. And even then, it was only because of a loophole in Florida law that because it was a redistricting year, I could get any registered voter in the state of Florida to sign. When you count in the fact that roughly half your votes are going to get tossed out by the supervisor of elections, plus the people are going to tell you to go to hell, plus the people are just going to say no, all of a sudden that 750 goes up to about 5,000 people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they'll stay up till the wee hours of the morning, tossing out every signature they can find an excuse to. If they don't just violate the law outright, like they did in 2 states with Gary Johnson, and even if you tried to do it in a major party, Ron Paul showed us that he was eligible to run for office, but the Republican Party broke both the law and their own rules to make sure that no one even had a chance of giving him a single vote as a nomination.
Yeah, pretty much.
Are you allowed to vote and participate and influence the policies?
Yes, I am.
Then what's the complaint?
Ah, yes, the magic voting ritual, because that works so well, doesn't it? Here's all you need to know about this point. In the 2012 election, Congress's approval rating got to the lowest ever up to that point, 10%. Then I think like a year or two later, it dipped down to 9%. But at that point, it had been the lowest approval rating ever. And yet, in the 2012 election, 90% of congressional incumbents, the House and Senate incumbents who ran for re-election, 90% of them got re-elected, even though the approval rating was 10%. How does that square with this whole, oh, it's great because you can vote thing?
It's the other guy's fault.
Well, it's not even that. It's like, yes, I'm terrible, but the guy running against me is even more terrible, so vote for me.
I mean, because most districts are set up that it doesn't matter who's running, as long as they have a D or an R in front of their name, that's who's going to get elected.
Yeah, they've got it all gerrymandered.
As a good friend of mine says, most voting is just like pro wrestling. You know it's all predetermined. No matter what, though, people come back to it.
So Jared replies,
let's say that if 49% of the population does not want something, and 51 does want something, the 51%
that's what we have a concept.
Right
that's what we. You are arguing that the government is a matter of a simple democracy, simple majority, and that's not the government we have by any stretch of the imagination. We have a constitution, which is what protects the minority from the whims of the majority.
Yeah, and how well's that working out? I mean, our president is a Nobel Peace Prize winner with a secret kill list and a fleet of flying killer robots that he claims the authority to use against American citizens without trial. You're telling me the Constitution is still a factor here?
You mean like how we've pretty much burned away the 4th and 5th Amendments?
How you don't even have to be convicted of a crime? How you can be outright acquitted and still get sentenced for it? Like we just covered?
No.
Is that basically if you don't have your right to enforce your will onto another person, and we have 2 political parties who both believe on, say, I don't know, taxation, and no matter who's ever going to win, someone's going to show up to my door if I don't pay my taxes.
Correct.
And say, hold on, let me finish. And then let's say you owe this amount of money, and eventually if I don't pay it, they will use force to take it from me.
Correct.
All right, so they admit and they acknowledge the taxes are collected by force, right? But then she says,
especially when my
you are here voluntarily.
Yeah, it's the whole you can leave thing, as long as you're willing to give up your job, your home, your community. No, come on, people. Let's call that idea what it is. Political exile.
Yeah, and again, it's not like all of a sudden you want to leave and go to Switzerland or England or any other country. That you can do that willy-nilly and say goodbye to the U.S., particularly if you're the kind of producer that's going to be paying taxes.
Yeah, if you can pay your expat tax and you can get through customs and everything.
God knows I couldn't pay an expat tax and all the other associated quote-unquote fees.
How can I afford to move? I've still got 15 years on a mortgage left to pay. You know, I got kids I'd have to bring with me.
I have a dog that's illegal in a lot of countries.
That's true. That's true. But I want to do something here. I want to compare government to a mafia protection racket. And I really wish Dave were here so he could do the voice. I can't do the voice as good as he does. But the mob shows up at your place of business and they're all like, pay up or bad things will happen. But if you do pay, we'll protect you. So you pay them. And then armed gang members come around or whatever. You just call them up and they show up like, oh, he's under our protection. So how is this any different? I mean, you can leave, can't you? You can close up shop and go open up your business someplace that isn't under mafia control, can't you? And the mafia is not going to make you pay a $2,350 expat tax.
There you go.
Yeah, I actually think I like the mafia deal a little better.
Yeah, at least the mafia is not going to try to break your leg if you don't pay or if you do pay up, they're not going to break your leg. I mean, you do pay your taxes, the government's going to find a way to screw with you anyway.
Oh, yeah, and then not protect you. Like Warren versus D.C. I mean, we'll talk about that in a minute. But
the drug wars and the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which I don't support, so you're taking my money to support something that I find immorally wrong.
Tough.
You don't get to run the country individually. This is a society, and there is a social contract that you are a part of, not the king of.
How has the social contract not been intellectually trashed from one end to the next?
If a Christian person wanted to say that by the social contract, taxpayer money should be used as vouchers to go to school at a Christian school, these would be the first people screaming that it was BS.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all based on tacit consent and all sorts of other things that would be, if you had an actual contract that worked that way, would be thrown out of any court in the civilized world. And it's a contract they can't even show you. And what I want to know is, what does government have to do to breach this contract? Because the idea is, oh, you don't pay your taxes or whatever, they'll come after you and put you in jail because you broke your end of the contract. Well, what does government have to do to break their end? I mean, if the fleet of flying killer robots doesn't do it for you. What about Warren versus D.C., where the Supreme Court ruled that the police are under no obligation to provide you with police services when you call them?
Oh, God.
We've got cops arresting people for videotaping them in the line of duty, which there's not a single law against anywhere. And do I have to bring up Kelly Thomas again?
Did I ever speak about my time on this podcast about when I spent a semester working with the Innocence Project of Florida? The Innocence Project of Florida was a nonprofit that used DNA evidence to clear people who were on death row.
Yeah, and they ended up clearing hundreds of people, didn't they?
Yeah, hundreds of people that would have been killed by the state and who were convicted in trial.
Well, and you have people like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. Chelsea Manning's in jail. Edward Snowden is in exile. I think he's still in Moscow. Is he still at the airport, or I don't know if he got to a hotel or something? But
I think I think that's actually sadly what's his face, Assange.
No, Assange is at the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
That's what I was saying. I think he's stuck in the wing of an embassy.
These are people. All they did was point out the stuff the government had done, which if there is this social contract thing would have been indefinite breach of it. They can't even let us know that the government's doing that. How is this any sort of valid contract?
Pay your taxes and we won't kill you.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it is.
As long as you are not coerced to stay here, you are voluntarily, every day you stay here, participating in the social contract at your free will.
Yeah, and as long as you stay in mafia-controlled territory, I guess you're voluntarily participating in that as well. I'm sorry, if your argument can be used to support a mob protection racket, it just isn't valid.
Let me just go get the hammer to jab the ice pick further in my skull.
By the way, when people make this argument, don't they basically take away every single reason to complain about there being any sort of monopoly? Like in the South Park episode about the cable company? Well, if you don't like it, why don't you go to another cable company? Aw, you can't. We're the only one. As the guy plays with his nipples.
If only South Park had followed that nut signed up with Hulu.
Yeah, that's true.
Please tell me which country does not have a form of government.
I don't know, whichever one you want to form.
Oh, and how do we do that? When the mob cartel known as government has already divided the world up, and even when we do have a country like the United States that's founded on the ideas of small government and individual liberty, and specifically John Locke's absolute rejection of the social contract, the statists end up taking it over and saying, tough, if you don't like it, you can leave. So then we leave, we set up somewhere else, the statists take over that one, and same thing again. Why don't you just go somewhere else? Aw, you can't. There's nowhere else on the planet to go. Government is everywhere.
But Shane, Somalia. I don't know about you. I love a war-torn, failed state that's essentially a bunch of group of city-states.
Socialist ones at that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you not think that we're better off in the United States?
Where you have a right to participate?
Where you have roads?
Yep, here we go. The roads. Hey, Matt, I've got news for you. Many, if not most of the roads on the East Coast were not built by government. They were built by people working together voluntarily. And I don't mean voluntarily as in, we'll force you to pay if you don't leave. I mean they actually worked together, absent government, to do it. And then government declared eminent domain over all the roads and left us with the crap we have now.
Where you have sewers, where you have education, where you have the internet, where you have the cell phone that you're calling me on?
Yes, because those things are impossible without government. Cult of the omnipotent state time. I mean, we had an educational system far superior to France or Britain before any government involvement, and it's been slipping ever since.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, we just need to get over this idea that government invented the internet. It didn't. And I'm linking in the show notes to an article from the Foundation for Economic Education, and this is from Andrew P. Morris, where he talks about, quote, the internet today bears little resemblance either to what the government wanted to build or to what it actually built. The innovations in networking that produced today's net occurred as much despite government funding as because of it. The internet represents the success of spontaneous ordering over central planning, not the successful design of a new technology by the state. And he does a really good job at length of going through it and supporting all that.
If you compare the internet to when it was really controlled by the state versus what it is now,
no resemblance. But really all it was ARPANET. It goes into that in detail and tells you like how it happened. But it was pretty much the regulatory capture of private resources by individuals pursuing their own interests, because you had all this government funding they had that didn't have strings attached that they could spend in however they want. And so they just decided to go and pioneer this kind of stuff and try and write these protocols, which they did a completely sucky job of, which is why we have things like email spam.
I actually had a professor who was involved with ARPANET. At the time, the government paid him by line of code.
Yeah.
So they would actually make stuff that was
bloated,
that could basically barely function, but it did by the government standard. But because it was 300 lines of code instead of 40.
Yeah. Well, he also talks about government crowding out. He says, quote, not only did the government directly seize resources through taxation and lock up knowledge in classified documents, and that actually happened. You know, a lot of times someone will come up with an innovation in networking, government would say, nope, it's ours, it's classified, we have to keep it secret from the Russians. It also lured many of the best computer scientists to work on its projects, slowing private sector activity. Setting up a network required permission from the FCC. Existing communications companies like Western Union fought the creation of new networks. Even when a private packing switching network, Telenet, began operation, many millions in legal expenses were required to fight the regulatory battle prompted by RCA, ITT, AT&T, and Western Union. This kept Telenet from making profits for years. Regulatory barriers to entry, not a lack of entrepreneurial activity, slowed the efforts to build private networks.
Al Gore did not invent the goddamn internet.
And basically, ARPANET and all of the networks that grew up around it were shut down completely in 1990. And so network traffic ended up being a mix of private and public transmission lines. And in 1995, when the government finally relinquished all control of it, that was when you had this explosion, both in the growth of the internet and in the innovations in internet technology. So at best, you can say that the internet was started by government workers who did it because government had an open-ended policy. Well, I want to tell you a little story about something very similar that happened in the private sector around that time. There was a guy who worked at Hewlett-Packard, and at that point, HP had a policy that anyone who wanted to could just go into the part supply closet, get whatever parts they want, build whatever they want, do whatever they want with it, and their only stipulation was that you had to give HP first crack at it to say, okay, yes, we want to produce this, market, and sell it. And if they said no, it was yours and you could do whatever you want to with it. So this guy did it, and he brought it to them, and he said, hey, HP, here's this thing I built. What do you think? You want to do it? And they went, nah. Okay, so it was his. So he called up his friend, hey, I got something to show you. Went over to the garage of his friend's parents' house. That guy's name was Steve Wozniak, and his friend was Steve Jobs. And they invented the Apple computer. So government invented the internet the way Hewlett-Packard invented the Apple and the Mac and the iPhone and all the stuff that came after that. So can you imagine HP trying to take credit for all of that? That's exactly what it's like when you say government created the internet.
Well, it doesn't have a lowercase I in front of it, so it doesn't matter.
Lowercase I, capital Internet. Internet. Okay, maybe not.
My thing is, the ends do not justify the means.
Nobody's putting a gun to your head.
I just don't think you understand how social contracts work. I don't think you get it.
But they've already acknowledged that if you don't pay, you get a gun pointed to your head. But that's okay because you can leave if you want. I'm sorry, but no contract that works that way is valid. Not for the mafia, not for government, not for anyone.
Yeah, I find it very immoral to support the war on drugs. And I splice the letter to the government. I do not want to support this. They will use force and take my tax money from me. And that is my property rights. Those are the fruits of my labor.
How did you get that property? Who granted you that property? Who granted you the right to property?
Basically, that would be a contract between me and another individual that we both voluntarily agreed to.
Money isn't owned by people.
What?
Oh, God.
Yes, it is.
So wait, are they saying money is owned by the government? Are they saying the property is owned by the government?
The money is owned by the government is what they're saying.
And again...
But government did not invent money.
Yeah.
It was invented by people trading because barter was too complex.
Yeah, it's a very simple idea of what is money.
Look throughout history. Look at all those little tribal systems where they traded with each other, absent any kind of government. What did they do? None of them were barter. There really has never been a barter economy any time in history because it's so unworkable. People end up immediately creating some sort of money, and they gravitate to gold and silver for various reasons that I've gone into in other videos. But other people have used rice. They've used, rocks with a hole cut in the middle, all sorts of things.
The famous example of Manhattan Island was traded for beads. It wasn't because the Indians were morons. It was because the beads were rare and valuable in their society.
Yeah, and they could trade those beads for a lot of stuff.
It's the same example of things that we think are silly that depreciate in value very quickly.
Well, a lot of people think gold is silly to use as money, so there you are.
Think about someone who would trade, a lot of things for a brand new Corvette. In 10 years, it's not going to be worth a lot of money, but it'll be, it's worth something then.
He pays me well. Unfortunately, force imposes.
Who enforces the contracts?
Boy, I wish you could see her face here in the podcast. She has this big smile, and she's all lit up like she thinks she's just made some knockdown argument. As if people haven't come up with 150 different ways of enforcing contracts without government.
My parents got a pool installed when I was like 12, and it was done pretty half-assed. And long story short, they had an arbitrator that was through the Professional Guild of Pool Builders of Florida. And this wasn't even done through the government. This was just done through their professional association. And the people who built the pool had to give them had to basically refund their entire check.
And doing it through the government would have taken years, and you would have had legal fees through the roof. But I mean, you've got options. You can go to the Better Business Bureau. You've got websites like Equibly and netarb.com. Visa and MasterCard have options for transactions using their systems. Again, we talked about the darknet. Even there, where it's a bunch of criminals dealing in drugs, completely absent the government, they've put in all sorts of protections in place for enforcing payment transactions. And to say we need government to do that is nothing short of the cult of the omnipotent state.
You mean like the mafia?
Whoa, where'd you come from?
I finally showed up. You people want me to come on this show, and you want me to give you an example of the mafia. You mess with us, we break your legs. That's just how we do it. You can't argue with a mob. What are you gonna do? That's just the way it is. Same thing with the government. What are you gonna do? You ain't gonna do anything. This is what happens when you mess with the top guys. You just don't do it.
Yeah, but the thugs from a different mob are coming to my store and making threats, so I'm calling you up. I'm paying you protection money.
Who are you going to call, the government? They'll charge you extra.
Dave Turcotte joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, we had just made a point about enforcing contracts without a government. But I mean, we were talking about things like, the Better Business Bureau and the things they do on the darknet to enforce contracts without the government, and how you do it without breaking people's legs.
This is basically a point-by-point, every non-creationist thing we bitch about on this show.
All in one.
Actually, and Dave owns a pit bull as well, so we both own dogs that would be illegal to take to most countries to flee the U.S.
Of course.
What other options could there be?
Could there be? Actually, that would be a very good thing. If there was no government, you would come up with a voluntary system done by society. Which
you would go to your neighbor with a gun and enforce it yourself.
Mediators.
It would be crazy.
Mediatorship.
You're describing a government.
No, he's not. He's describing a private entity in the free market providing a service. It's not a government because you're not forced to use that one and only arbitration company. It's not a monopoly. You can choose anyone you want to arbitrate. That is the difference. You have a choice.
Instead of a government that we've all, participated in and elected, now we've got a bunch of little miniature mediators that the two of us have agreed to. So let's say you and I have a disagreement, and we then agree to allow Tracie to be the mediator between the two of us.
Yeah, I get to be the authority, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
And the two.
I'm the government.
And
no, because we have a choice of going with someone other than Tracie. I mean, why is that so hard to understand?
It's once again one big G or another. So-and-so is God because we put all our faith in it, even though there's plenty of examples of other gods. So-and-so is the government, even though there are plenty of other examples of different governments or different entities that can do the same job.
Now, once we've decided that we've agreed on this and Tracie makes her ruling and she rules in your favor, and I decide that I'm no longer going to accept Tracie's authority, what do you do then?
Well, then it's too late. It's already done. I mean, look at the example we covered on the darknet. They have this escrow-like system that's actually cryptographically protected. You have the buyer and the seller engaging a transaction, and you have the trusted third party. The transaction can either go through and go to the seller or get reversed and go back to the buyer on the say of any two participants. And since it's all done cryptographically, you don't need a government to protect you. You just need math. That's all you need, just math.
Math isn't exactly the government's strong suit. How do you think we got into such a bad debt?
Yeah, true.
Math is like kryptonite to them.
I still say instead of that, we just all call for a king in the north. We just hope he doesn't have a wolf head.
Basically a private organization that would basically would do justice.
You're just building a government and you're calling it private.
No, you're not, unless you want to define government so broadly that it means any group of people who can do anything.
That's the way people like it.
Well, I'm a government then.
Well, look, if you insist on calling that a government, fine. We'll just say that's the good kind of government because it doesn't use force to maintain its monopoly power. It's the monopoly power that we object to.
Again, that requires critical thinking, which, that's hard.
But they do it all the time. They do it all the time on, religious issues and everything else. They know how to do it. That's the thing that gets me. These guys are pretty much experts at critical thinking.
Yeah, but when it comes to things they don't want to do, well, then it's too hard.
Because the rest of us in society would rather have a government that imposes the thing that you supposedly agreed to than to be stuck with no possible recompense.
But that's a false dichotomy. As I just explained, those are not the only two options.
Once again, that's another example of I'm in the 51%, fuck you in the 49%.
Oh, but the Constitution. Don't forget the Constitution.
It's a very all-or-nothing mentality.
Yeah.
Oh, you're not in favor of government-run healthcare? Well, that means you want poor people to die. It sounds all the same to me.
Yeah, if government doesn't do it, it doesn't get done. That's the essence of it. So he tries to make a comparison to slavery, and Matt immediately hangs up on him. And then after hanging up on him, replies,
hey, how many slaves had the opportunity to,
leave?
Leave?
Well, actually, thousands did, thanks to the free market innovation of the Underground Railroad, while government was constantly capturing runaway slaves and prosecuting those who helped them escape. So once again, I have to ask, what more can government possibly do to be considered to be in breach of this social contract?
Did anyone else here see 12 Years a Slave?
I didn't see that.
No.
Very good movie, I'll say. But the essence of the movie is the main character is a free black man living in New York. He's a musician by trade, and he gets an offer to do a show in D.C. And before he leaves for D.C., he gets his quote-unquote freedom papers that shows he's a free black man. And long story short, he gets drugged, they burn his freedom papers, and through a government-run auction, sell him into slavery.
That sort of thing happened all the time.
And even after slavery, they still were scratching and clawing as a way to screw black people over. Look at Jim Crow laws. That was a government thing.
Oh yeah, we talked about those a while back, and you also had the whole sharecropping thing. That was another way of keeping him down.
Yeah. And actually, in 12 Years a Slave, that was a thing to where it was government policy to reject the idea that they ever bought free black people. Like, oh, no, they're just recaptured slaves.
I am all in favor of freedom, and I am all in favor of finding actual problems with any government and working to correct them.
Sure.
But apparently questioning the validity of government itself is off the table.
Even if you don't want to question the validity of government, there is still flagrant issues of corruption, bureaucratic incompetence, and whatnot that there is no issue of being solved because it happens to suit a political agenda you agree with.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's pretty much been established that you make a decision subconsciously, and then consciously you come up with the rationalization for it, and a lot of the critical thinking techniques are there to try and bypass that and prevent it from happening. But when you're emotionally attached to something, it won't even occur to you that you're not thinking critically, that you're bypassing all that, and that's a big problem.
It's like what Penn Jillette's sentiments were on the bullshit episode dealing with NASA. I love NASA. They've done a lot of really cool stuff. They still do cool stuff. But they should be abolished. When I think about it rationally and without any emotion.
Well, here's the ironic thing about this. Listen to what they said to the very next caller on the subject of abortion.
Laws are not merely codified morals. We don't make something legal or illegal merely because we view it as immoral. There are plenty of laws that do fall along those lines, basically because we've demonstrated that they are for the betterment of society.
Okay, we could quibble with the phrase betterment of society, but what he's fundamentally saying here, which is quite in line with what he said in the past, is that you need a positive reason to pass a law and use force against others. In other words, the burden of proof is on the side that wants to use force. And yet with the previous caller, they spent over 10 minutes shifting that burden of proof with who will build the roads, how would you solve disputes? No, you need to show that government and only government can do these things if you want to go defending its violent monopoly.
Isn't that how it always works?
Yeah.
God damn you having a consistent set of morals.
The interesting thing about this is, this show is actually responsible for me becoming a stronger libertarian. Them and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and all of those. Seeing how they properly framed the atheism debate, they went from first principles, they struck the root, they established burden of proof, and taking those ideas and doing the same thing with political principles, using the same first principles that Dillahunty is on record agreeing with, and building it up from there, it absolutely leads you to the non-aggression principle and therefore libertarianism.
And to me, it's a shame, because it seems like the root of why those in the atheist movement who don't go into libertarianism, it's basically solely because, oh, Christians are Republicans, therefore I'm a Democrat, we have to hate them.
Which also means you have to put up with all the crap on the Democrat side.
It really is a shame to those that don't apply a consistent set of principles.
Sadly, it's become a case of a team sport, like most politics when it comes to the masses. It's because, oh, well, they believe that stuff, therefore we have to believe the opposite no matter what.
And it's all that makes Matt Dillahunty and Tracie Harris this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.